Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Charles. You're listening to Bring It All Back Home. Today's episode is going to be a look back at two artists who I kind of rediscovered in a way. And the theme is around a certain location and a certain characteristic. The location is Paris, specifically the early 30s. You might even just nail it to 1931. The characteristic is just curiosity, unbelievably unbridled, pure curiosity. And the artists are Henry Miller, and for the photography folks, because this is a photography podcast, more specifically the artist known as Brassai. So yeah, this is about Brassai Miller night photography at its infancy and how it led to an eBay purchase, because in the end, isn't that what it's all about? So yeah, find a beverage of choice. I've just got a glass of water here, and let's go back to the 1930s and see if this podcast can kind of find some new angles on two artists who did some interesting stuff back then. All right, so right off the bat, I just want to kind of break down what truly led me to rediscover this stuff. It was a combination of rereads and at least one new read. It started last year when I finally discovered it had been decades since I reread a book it was an autobiography by the very, very famous surrealist known as Louis Buñuel. Yeah, Louis Buñuel and his pal Salvador Dali introduced one of the most influential, groundbreaking films that was very, very influential on Henry Miller. That was, and again, I apologize about my horrible pronunciations today, but it's in English, it's an Andalusian dog. In French, it was un Chien Andalou, if I got that right. Hugely important movie. You've probably seen little stills from it. Shocking, provocative, and very, very, like it was. If we keep, even today, anything that's unusual, people will describe as or shocking as surreal. This is really, if you want to just go, well, what is surrealism? It's, I'm sure, up on YouTube. Watch The Andalusian Dog. Watch Buñuel's masterpiece. He directed it. The script was co-written with him and Dali. Anyhow, that's how it started. I reread his autobiography. And then sure enough, shortly afterward, as this year began, I decided to reread, in my opinion, the greatest book by Henry Miller, which most people don't know about. And it was a collection of his letters. It was his letters to his pal, Emil or Emil. Again, there's a million different ways to pronounce, or not a million, there's at least three different ways to pronounce his buddy Emil. But it's called Letters to Emil, or Emil. And it's really these are legitimately desperate letters to his friend while Henry Miller was scrambling every single day as someone without a job, without any prospects, and two absolutely failed writing attempts. And he's literally he's just watching what little money he had disappear. And it's the winter and spring of 1931. And he somehow pulls it around. He somehow gains his courage. But more importantly, why I always go back to Letters to Emil is the unbelievable, and I've read this book, no exaggeration, even though it's been at least a decade or more since I've read it. Back in the 90s, I reread that book multiple times. It's my absolutely favorite book by Miller. It's Miller at his least pretentious. It's just him being absolutely honest about the struggles that pertain to his very precarious life at that time. But more importantly, it was just this incredible curiosity about every single street he discovered in Paris. And this almost giddy to the point of possibly manic obsession with new things he discovered, and how he would just bring his reader, his pal, his pen pal, you could say, his only source of hope as he's conveying this stuff to Emil. He was really finding his real voice. He was finally finding what made Henry Miller, and he would mix in these incredibly detailed, amazingly wide open impressions and journalistic tours of these different neighborhoods in Paris with, suddenly, as it got into later 1931, these little sketches of the folks he was living with or cohabitating with or working with or meeting on the streets of Paris, especially the streets of Paris at night. And who else was observing the streets of Paris at night? This journalist, who was originally born at the time it was part of the Hungarian Empire. I think technically it's Transylvania, so you got the Dracula thing going on there at night. But yeah, he was this really interesting guy who is in some ways the great influencer of shooting a city at night, and that's Brassai. I think his original name, whose pronunciation I'll probably butcher, is Uli Halas. But anyway, he had a very, he was obviously born in Europe, and he had, from what I understand from his biography, he had been in Paris as a much, much younger person. I think even I don't think he was even a teenager yet in his youth. Maybe, I think he was around 6 or 7 years old. His dad had received a kind of promotion to teach at the Sorbonne. And even though they were from, what was then Hungary, he was allowed to live in Paris for at least a year. And then the kind of like the teacher thing wrapped up, and they were forced, of course, to go back home. World War I kicked in just as again, I'm talking about Brassai, just as Brassai came of age, he was drafted into World War I on the other side, fighting for the Austro-Hungarian / German side, and they, of course, lost horribly. He was lucky to come out of that struggle alive. Not a lot of details about what he was, that I could uncover, what he was up to during World War I. And that prevented him from actually even visiting Paris for quite a number of years, because, the last thing they wanted to do was allow even a kind of temporary citizenship to the folks they were just fighting against. But eventually, in the mid-20s, he was allowed to come back to Paris and work as a pretty successful journalist. At no time during his early journalism years was Brassai attracted necessarily to photography, but eventually he kind of got the nudge to get into it, seeing how successful other artists had been using it. I think the one artist that he mentions a lot was it Andre Cortez? Yeah, it was Andre Cortez. And there's an interesting overlap during this time. So we're talking about the late 20s now into the early 30s. What I found fascinating, especially doing the research for this podcast, was that even though at that time the earliest Leica, the Barnacks, as we call them, the earliest Leicas were out there, Cortez and especially, of course, Brassai, they favored the traditional, in a sense, for them, the more artistic tools of a large format. But of course, the large format was just ridiculous trying to use that out in the streets as a journalist. So eventually, or coinciding with this time period, Voigtlander came up with a much more compact version. Same idea as a large format. It's essentially this camera that would unfold, and you had bellows. You also had a little bit of tilt and shift with the lens. The lens could also be changed out. And what you would drop in after you found the focus would be glass plates, and that's almost exclusively what you're getting when you look at the most influential work by Brassai. So he's out there with a wooden tripod of sorts. There's this wonderful picture I'm going to use as the main picture for the podcast. He's out there in the snow on the streets of Paris. He's wearing this cool hat. He's got a cigarette dangling, or hand-rolled Gauloise cigarette hanging from his mouth. And it looks like he's essentially just composing the image before he begins the long exposure. So that's kind of the areas I'd like to get into for this episode. I'm going to come back to the Voigtlander. Obviously, as I hinted in the beginning, this led to an eBay purchase. But what I really want to start with is this fusion of what really made these guys stand out as far as Miller and Brassai, Henry Miller and Brassai. One of the main themes for Miller that really, really made him a somewhat archetypal influence for me in my 20s, or very much so when I was in my 30s too, was he was a latecomer. He did not really become an artist in any way successfully till he was almost 40. And what's so astonishing about Miller, especially as I, reread his stuff and reread, there was another book I just recently finished called Renegade, Henry Miller and the Making of Tropic of Cancer, which is probably the book most people, if they know of him at all, they know of Henry Miller and Tropic of Cancer. But what makes Henry so freaking fascinating, and especially this book to his pal Emil, was during this same period, 1930, 31, 32. It's no exaggeration. He absolutely had no prospects. So let's break this down. So basically, I grew up in Brooklyn. Miller came from a kind of troubled family. His sister had some learning disabilities. His mom was very, very oppressive to the whole family. She didn't really understand why her predicament had fallen so fast. His father was a working tailor in Manhattan, but had developed a certain love of alcoholism to deal with whatever it was that was oppressing him. Maybe it was the marriage that wasn't really resolved, nor was it breaking up. And Henry just kind of fell in with a certain bunch of friends in Brooklyn who he really deeply admired. They moved. He kind of lost some of his friends, moved back. He was very, very upset about the changing situation in these two different parts of Brooklyn that he came up with. He had a very... he struggled with the changing of the neighborhoods and the influx of immigrants, but at the same time, he had this extraordinary ability, which people commented on, that if something really interested him, he could be a great storyteller, and he could really summon out of nowhere this expansive spirit that could just draw people in. He had an interesting inflection to his voice. He would typically just keep people really interested in his storytelling, in the way he would expand and kind of throw these slightly unusual prospects or perspectives rather into whatever narrative he was weaving on the fly. Anyhow, as he graduated, nothing really was working for him. He tried a little bit of college. That didn't quite work out. He tried this adventure out west. That didn't quite work out. And next thing you know, he's back living with his folks. He's already in his 20s. Nothing seems to be happening. And the last place he wants to work is at his father's tailor shop. And of course, that's exactly where he's working. So he's stuck in this job that seems to have no redemption to it at all. He's kind of antithetical to the whole idea of progress. So this is the glorious 20s where everybody should be sharp and snappy and trying to build on the American dream of just making a big success out of your career and starting a successful family and proving that the American dream for being successful at least is what it's all about. And no, that just never really appealed to young Henry Miller. And of course, he just fell into one catastrophe after another. A woman whom he was involved with, got pregnant, of course, and he reluctantly got married there. And the marriage was just as bad, if not worse, than his parents' marriage. And, you could just see where this is going. He's just suddenly this younger man, or maybe not so young now as he reached the end of his 20s, kind of just feeling trapped in both a bad job, a bad marriage, and he finally, through the influence of a very unstable but magnetic personality, this dancer he met at a club in New York, who went by several different names. She's known in his novels as June. And she just said to him, "Look, you're an artist. You should be an artist. You should live as an artist." And next thing you know, he's abandoning the marriage, abandoning his kid, moving in with her. And so as the rest of the 1920s proceed, we're talking like 6, 7, 8, 9, approaching 1930, his life is just a mess now, but in a more dynamic way, because June is both an incredible muse to him, but at the same time, she's got a kind of fantasy version of Henry, a version of him that maybe he doesn't even really recognize. And not all, but what she really wants is someone to make her kind of immortal, to someone to capture her story and bring to her life, this sort of Hollywood version of immortality. And meanwhile, Henry is still stuck on trying to write like these 19th century authors he deeply admires in a more traditional, huge, third party plot. And he's failing miserably. So there's at least 3 novel attempts. There's even so I kept mentioning he had two unfinished books. There was actually a third that was so awful that his friends were just like, "Don't even show me that again." He got a tiny bit better, but yeah, most of his prose was just weighed down. It was lifeless, and then at the same time bloated, and often it just didn't sound like him at all. It just sounded like Henry trying to imitate somebody else. So cut to the chase. At the same time that he's going truly nowhere now, and he's living off of his now wife, June, his second wife, she's making her money in extremely dubious ways, possibly even prostituting herself to support Henry. And at the same time, she's developed another relationship with this other woman who is now living with them. And at the same time, one of her hobbies is to build little puppets and mannequins and not mannequins, I guess, just she would carve out these unique puppets, and sort of these images sort of tormented Miller. So at the same time, he's completely lost it. It's like he's insanely jealous of the woman who his wife is having an affair with. He's a complete failure at his artistic life. He literally has no money. And he decides finally, ironically, through the help of June, to just go off to Paris and just see what it does. Maybe Paris will save him. Maybe this Paris experience is going to bring his artistic life to fruition. And these letters, again, it all comes back to this one book, Letters to Emil, are so real. They're not this literary thing. They're not just Henry trying to pretend he's some other author. They're a mixture of this incredible eye of absorbing the poverty, absorbing how other people around him are living, and especially taking in the really unsavory bits of of these parts of Paris that he's struggling to even survive in, one hotel after another, until eventually he doesn't have any money left for hotels. He's literally flopping at people's houses when they're at work, you know. And that's where the Letters to Emil really shine and never lose their luster to me. I could go back and reread that stuff so many times because it's absolutely a moment where he should have, by any measure, he should have never have succeeded past here. His writing sucks. His two marriages are just a catastrophe. He does not know anybody in Paris, really. And he's just another hanger-on at the cafes waiting to see if there's someone who could essentially throw him a dime, like be able to just buy him a cup of coffee, get him enough money for a sandwich. And meanwhile, nothing's happening. Like nothing's happening. There's no way to get out of this mess. So you may wonder, what was the magical ingredient? Like what finally did it? It was in the letters. In the Letters to Emil, he finally realizes, having had a tiny bit of success, where he did this little bit of a kind of photojournalistic essay about a woman, who was stuck on the streets. And again, this by this time the Depression hadn't hit Paris as hard as it was going to hit New York. But yeah, there was an incredible amount of poverty in Paris. But yeah, it was a woman who, to survive, was using her body to get by, one of the many, 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 many streetwalkers, prostitutes around certain areas of Paris where Henry Miller was. He did a kind of sketch about her called Madame Claude. And it got published in a small kind of literary magazine at the time, and it started capturing his voice. And then finally he just says to Emil, you know what, I'm going to just start a whole new project. I'm going to call it like the Paris book, and forget about form, forget about the novel, forget about everything. And he just kept using this expression, F everything, just F everything. That's when it finally kicks in. So the book, which eventually became Tropic of Cancer, was this slightly episodic, but at the same time mixed with this surrealism journey into the night of Paris, and of course a journey into the really degrading, to put it honestly, degrading circumstances that a lot of his friends were in, or acquaintances by now. But at the same time, there was this rebellious spirit in him that just was like, you still can't put me down. Like, ironically, this is when he found the power to just be in a good mood, to still be happy, to still be thrilled to be observing all this life around him. Okay, so how does this lead to Brassai? The two met. The two were suddenly involved with each other. He met Brassai, and together the two of them would go on these journeys at night. And Henry just acted as his assistant because, yeah, I'm sure he needed somebody else to possibly, help him with the gear. At the same time, once in a while, Brassai would use a flash, especially on some of the scenes where he was shooting indoors. Because again, these were extremely slow speed film plates, whether he was shooting with the 6x9 Voigtlander, or he was shooting possibly with the other formats. I think there was a 6.45 and a 6x6, I believe. But yeah, typically it was the 6x9. And yeah, Miller was probably there helping assist with the setup, assist possibly with holding the flash. And Brassai and Miller, they were never really tight friends. In fact, later on, 20 or 30 years later, Miller kind of dissed Brassai a little bit, saying like, yeah, in his last book, he was claiming this and claiming that. I was never that close with them. But, regardless of that, I think it's just at that point, Henry was kind of suspicious of people who were suddenly embellishing what were now the glory years of the early 30s in Paris. So yeah, they did a lot of jaunts together. The photography that Brassai produced by itself technically does not impress, and it can't. Again, he was working with these limitations of extremely slow speed film. But what really is so revolutionary about his stuff, and I actually had a chance in the 90s, early 90s, to go up to New York and see an exhibit of Brassai's prints. And yeah, I was a little bit stunned because they were very, very small prints. They were very, very, I'll be blunt about it. They seemed crude. You know what I mean? Because, you're used to going to Manhattan, going to these galleries and seeing, even if it's an artist from the 20s or 30s, even like say at that time, Alfred Stieglitz or what have you, you go to MoMA, you still see some of these great, the earliest Ansel Adams, blah, blah, blah. You're used to like these fairly sophisticated darkroom things. No, the Brassai stuff, similar to Miller, was very homemade. He was just shooting this stuff, developing it, in his hotel room, on these fairly small, fairly small little darkroom setup. But they're wonderful because just like Miller, they crossed the line. They really crossed the line. So there's the famous, there's been different collections, but one of his collections is just called Paris at Night. And the majority of it is these sort of graphically interesting long exposures showing the cobblestone, showing the streets, showing the fog. And then you get a little taste of the sort of sordid nightlife of Paris, where you see homeless people, you see streetwalkers, you see people huddled under the bridge. You get a little bit of a taste of, the kind of stuff that at that time was not what people expected from photography. They, expected photography to be this life-affirming, beautiful stuff. But no, Brassai was really just all about the grit. Like, he didn't care. What's interesting about the two of them, they both described each other of having this insatiable curiosity. And that's exactly how Miller described Brassai, as just being like the eye of Paris, that nothing would stop him, even with the freaking tripod and the corny setup you had to go through with the Voigtlander. Nothing would stop him from walking into parts of Paris that most people wouldn't dare to go, let alone as someone who's going to record it. There was a thing with Brassai that Miller didn't have. Brassai knew Paris even better than Miller, of course. He had lived there as a journalist for at least 10 years, possibly, or say by 1931. He had been there. Okay, maybe I'll get my chronology a little bit wrong. At least 7 years he'd been working there. So he knew and was comfortable with a lot of establishments that were somehow off limits to most journalists, or off limits to places where you could get beat up and rolled, as they would say. But yeah, he would invite Miller in, and so there's another book that he later on published before he passed away that is a little bit more risque, and it's this stuff where basically the brothels and the areas where the gangs would kind of congregate. So you could this almost anticipates some of the work, you might say, from the 60s, when certain, London photographers were embracing, the underworld of the Cray brothers and stuff, but still working in shooting them in 6x6, say. So yeah, there was this mixture of criminality, or at least sordidness, that neither one of them cared about. Like, they just felt, especially Miller at this time, sort of felt like the world was, as he would say, going to smash. Like, he just anticipated that everything about where the major industrialized countries and societies were heading was disaster. He was sort of pulled down constantly by this very, very pessimistic idea that it was all just going to just go to hell. Essentially that we just are not heading as a society into a place where there would be any kind of peace. And this is before. This was all his Letters to Emil and Tropic of Cancer this was all published and written before Hitler even came to power in Germany. So that wouldn't have been to 1933. This stuff was just a couple years earlier. It's interesting, the sort of apocalyptic hints about where society is going. In some ways, you could say Miller was just experiencing in his bones. But at the same time, what makes his crazy writing at this period so unique was that there was still this animalistic joy in still being a survivor, of being alive, of not letting, this is almost, again, this sort of manic depressive, there's almost this kind of pull, he's yin and yang with Miller, where he's either being pulled down by these horribly dark premonitions about how terrible things could get, but at the same time, he just felt like, F you, Jack, you're not getting me pulled down. I'm still gonna do my thing, even though it was to some degree a kind of destructive thing, because a big part of Tropic Cancer is a kind of spewing of bile. It is not a very happy and friendly and generous view of his friends and compatriots. It very much was like, let me bite the hand that feeds me, literally. So in the book, a repetitive theme constantly is Miller mocking and just going deep into really just trying to essentially libel, which he admits in the first couple of pages, like this is slander, this is libel, this is not, this is a spit, gob of spit. It had this kind of punk precursor to it with this really mishmash energy. So and unfortunately at the time, there are traces in Cancer of regrettable bigotry too. I don't want to leave that out. I want to and unfortunately for me, I think that's the part that ages that book terribly, is when I just reread it a couple of weeks ago. I just felt like, wow, like stuff that I just kind of overlooked in my 20s, now I'm like, geez, Henry, like but whatever, that was quote unquote Henry not following any rules. But overall, I think, for every line of bigotry and contempt that Miller would throw into Tropic Cancer, it was trying to be balanced out too, because there's nobody got off. No one. It was take everyone prisoners in a weird way. It almost redeems itself, but ultimately, I think the book that everybody will find his humanity in is those Letters to Emil, because that's not him being that Henry Miller, the author. That's Henry just being himself completely, and you do absolutely see this in tremendous humanity in his actual letters. But again, going back to Miller and Brassai and how they both complement each other, they just both had this creative need to use this environment around them, especially at night, and just take it all in and try to bring it into a kind of art form. And again, I mentioned earlier Louis Buñuel, and I'm thinking of maybe doing a podcast just on Louis Buñuel, but Louis Buñuel was the single, other than Miller suddenly deciding to F everything and just write the way he's been writing to Emil, it was Louis Buñuel's surrealist film that was the number one a positive influence to turn him around. And yeah, you could say that the surrealists, had this idea that what we dream, what the discordant reality of the way things follow, and again, this is where it can be sometimes misunderstood, not a fantasy. There's nothing even though they seem to be the same thing. Surrealism is not fantasy. Fantasy is essentially a lot of wish fulfillment. Like, wouldn't it be great if I had this and that superpower? Wouldn't it be great if I had this fantastic episode appear with my characters or myself even? Wouldn't it be cool if animals could talk and et cetera, and following different types of myth. Surrealism is a reaction against that, even though it uses some of the same elements. So in something that's surreal, there are elements of the fantastic, but surrealism is really, really trying to tap into the true dream state. Like when we're actually in a dream, things will be discordant and things will just seemingly have no logical connection. So it's not like a sweetened fantastic reality that's full of wish fulfillment. No, dreams can just be literally this combination of sound and imagery that seemingly makes no sense, and the surrealists were there to try to bring that into art and bring that back into life and kind of in their own way fire a shot at rationality, so again, there was this sort of upswelling in the 30s in this one tiny part of the world, Paris, around the cafes and around Montmartre, etc., where these three artists, Buñuel with his movies and his scripts, Miller with his soon-to-be published first novel that finally became somewhat of a sensation, and Brassai running around with his Voigtlander, getting deeply intimate with realities that were not exactly sweet in any way. They were kind of harsh, but at the same time, he tried to show the humanity of it. He wasn't there to judge. Brassai, when he was doing this kind of photojournalism, was there to just be as honest as possible. And obviously, he had to have built up a rapport to even be invited to take his, whatever it was, 5 to 10 minutes to get even some of these shots. Anyhow, let's talk about the shots in the sense of let's go into the camera. So what he was using, again, I mentioned, was a Voigtlander. And the Voigtlander that I'm referring to was in production in the 20s. The one that I just found on eBay is practically 100 years old. So the one I found, I think most likely based on the serial stuff, was from 1927. And again, they refer to, just looking at some of the stuff here, that there was a classic 6x9 Voigtlander that was manufactured from 1923 to 32. And this particular form of the Voigtlander was simply known as the Voigtlander Bergheil. So sort of like a mountain greeting, and it has these really unusual ways of working. So there's a little thing you can flip out to the left side of the camera to help you compose, and then another little smaller gadget pops out, and you can kind of look through that and see possibly what your composition is. But yeah, essentially it was using, like I said, so you would very much like a large format, you would have a viewer that would show you, of course, what the camera's seeing, and you would help hopefully with the bellows, find your focus, and then you would take that out and insert the glass plate. Or you would use an adapter, which came with the camera I just got off of eBay, still on the way, and that would be a Rada Plaubel 120 rollback adapter. So yeah, what I'm looking to do, if this thing actually works, is just like I said, take out the Voigtlander Bergheil, put it on a tripod, and find the focus. The guy who's selling it says it works. Whether or not the shutter speeds are close to accurate, I got a feeling I'm going to be trying it out with some Tri-X first, just to make sure it has so if it's missing a stop or two with the shutter, hopefully I can get something. But yeah, it looks like such a slow process, because yeah, you can't just shoot. You have to align, compose, find the focus, pull out the viewer, and pop in this case, the 120 roll adapter. So hopefully, if it does work, I will be back with a Voigtlander review. I did find one or two interesting YouTube videos about it, but I'm really excited. And if you are interested in Brassai, I wouldn't hesitate to look into one of his books called Paris by Night. That seems to be one of his most popular versions of his photos. And there are different ones out there too. And of course, I'll include this wonderful shot of him just smoking that Go West. There's a quote by him. I don't know if this is 100% true or just made a great story, but that he got to a point where with his hand-rolled cigarettes, he could figure out the exposure by just how far along the cigarette had burned. So if a certain lighting condition, if the Go West cigarette had burned halfway, he would know to take the shot. Another lighting condition, he would sit there and smoke even longer. But yeah, these were really, really long exposures, because I'm guessing the film may have been like, 25 ASA? Maybe 50 if they were lucky. That would have been high speed in the 20s. And again, yeah, they used to be Ilford used to sell these glass plates, which were so cool. That would be wonderful somehow to bring that back. Anyhow, guys, that's my little retro look at two interesting artists, Brassai and the literary career of Mr. Henry Miller. Anyhow, I'll catch you guys later.